He went down in history as the Flying Butcher, and that nickname wasn't accidental. Its salvo was so dense that it could turn an enemy plane into a flaming wreck in seconds. The cockpit temperature could climb up to 50 C, and pilots would emerge from combat on the verge of heat exhaustion. For the first time in the war, British aces admitted that their beloved Spitfire was no longer the king of the skies. And in the East, Soviet pilots noted with surprise that the newest German fighter didn't inspire the same terror as the old Messerschmitt. It had the reputation of a machine that could have won the war for the Luftwaffe, if only the Germans had been able to find a more powerful engine. It was dubbed the universal weapon. It was capable of being both a formidable fighter and a relentless bomber. But behind every victory lay scandals. Behind every success, a price rarely spoken of. Why did the plane, which could accelerate to 1,000 km/h in a dive, simultaneously drop like a brick with engine failure? And how did it happen that in the West it was considered a symbol of German supremacy, while in the East it was just another plane? Today, we will delve into its secrets. This video contains not only the triumphs and records, but also the shameful failures, the cunning games of the designers, and the cruel compromises that made the FW-190 simultaneously a legend and a tragedy of German aviation. Stay until the end. The most interesting parts are yet to come. When the Messerschmitt Bf-109 still reigned supreme in the skies of Europe, a new player appeared on the horizon, dubbed the Würger, Shrike, by British pilots. This predatory bird is not afraid to attack prey larger than itself, and this nickname suited the new fighter perfectly. The FW-190 quickly earned another name, the Flying Butcher. The British first encountered it over the English Channel and were stunned by its speed, the power of its salvo, and its ability to easily escape combat. There, in the West, it seemed a genuine challenge to the established leadership of the Bf-190. But once this machine appeared on the Eastern Front, the perception sharply changed. In the skies over the Soviet Union, it didn't make the same impression. It didn't leave behind the aura of a formidable adversary, as it had in battles with the Spitfires. Why did this happen? It wasn't just about the machine itself, but about who was sitting in the cockpit. Experienced Luftwaffe aces remained in the West, and new recruits, transitioning to the newest fighter, couldn't fully realize its potential. As a result, Soviet pilots often considered the old familiar, Messer, to be more dangerous. To understand why it became a sensation in the West, but never achieved the same fame in the East, we must return to its origins. Who was behind the creation of this machine? Why did it get a name that still confuses even aviation enthusiasts? The answers to these questions will lead us to the unexpected history of names, founders, and the very man who turned the FW-190 into a real challenge to the legendary Messerschmitt. Many people today, hearing the name Focke-Wulf, instinctively say Fokker and think of the Dutch biplanes of World War I. This confusion wasn't accidental. Fighters from the Fokker company, purchased or license-built, were indeed encountered in Soviet units. Therefore, for soldiers and technicians, that name was firmly associated with foreign technology. But that brand had nothing to do with our hero. The name Focke-Wulf itself is also misleading. Heinrich Focke was involved in experiments with the first prototypes of helicopters, and Georg Wolf died in the late 20s during a test flight. Neither of them had a hand in creating the new fighter, yet their surnames adorned the most modern machine of the Luftwaffe. Behind this paradox lay a simple truth. The company needed recognizable names to establish itself in the aviation industry. But the true creator of the FW-190 did not bear the surname Focke or Wolf. His name was Kurt Tank, a man whose persistence, talent, and ability to play a subtle game made possible the appearance of the fighter that challenged the legendary Messerschmitt. Kurt Tank was a person who couldn't be confined to one role. Unlike many armchair engineers of his time, he not only designed aircraft, but also flew them. This gave his designs a special practicality. He felt the machine in the air himself and understood what a pilot needed in real combat. His name was known even before the FW-190, thanks to two projects that left a noticeable mark on history. The first was the long-range FW-200 Condor. In civil service, it was a passenger airliner, but in the hands of the Luftwaffe, it became a ship hunter. The Condor terrorized the Atlantic, forcing the Allies to change their anti-submarine warfare tactics. The second was the FW-189, known to Soviet frontline soldiers by the nickname Rama for the distinctive glazing of its cockpit. This reconnaissance aircraft was a real headache on the Eastern Front. Slow but incredibly survivable, it would hover over positions and feed precise coordinates to German artillerymen. These projects already showed that Tank knew how to combine engineering intuition with calculated boldness. His colleagues spoke of him simply: he knows how to build, he knows how to fly, and he knows how to get his way in negotiations and backroom games. All three qualities became the foundation upon which the FW-190 project grew. It was at this moment, after the war in Spain, that the German command realized an unpleasant truth. Their acclaimed Bf-190 was not ideal. The Soviet I-16 showed that the Messer was vulnerable under certain conditions. It became clear that a new fighter was needed, one capable of combining speed, firepower, and survivability. Thus, a competition was announced, in which Kurt Tank saw his chance. The late 30s were a time for a re-evaluation of priorities in German aviation. The Bf-190, which had become famous in Spain, was not as flawless as the generals had hoped. Its design was well suited for the war here and now, but the military was looking ahead. By the standards of the time, a fighter's service life was estimated at only 5 to 7 years. By 1942, the Messerschmitt was objectively becoming obsolete, and a replacement was needed. The new competition set clear criteria for the designers. The machine had to be as survivable as possible, so the pilot could return even after serious damage. It had to be simple to maintain, as frontline mechanics worked in tough conditions and on hastily prepared airfields. The fighter had to operate confidently from strips where the ground was far from ideal, and equipment could get stuck or break from uneven surfaces. All this transformed the future aircraft not into a unique item for aces, but into a universal workhorse, suitable for mass use. Most designers gravitated towards the proven path, the liquid-cooled engine, more graceful and customary. But Kurt Tank decided to go against the grain. His choice seemed risky: the BMW-139 air-cooled radial engine. In an era when such an engine was considered bulky and detrimental to aerodynamics, he opted for reliability and survivability, confident that this was precisely what would give the machine a chance to displace the Bf-109. When Kurt Tank proposed using the BMW-139 air-cooled radial engine in the new fighter, it seemed almost a challenge to tradition. German engineers were accustomed to working with the elegant liquid-cooled engines from Jumo and Daimler-Benz. Compact and elongated, they allowed for streamlined fuselages and reduced drag. But Tank saw a different advantage. Air cooling meant survivability. Even if a few cylinders failed, the engine would keep running, allowing the pilot to return to base. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, where the slightest bullet hole in the system led to overheating and engine failure, the radial engine could withstand hits and remain operational. German and Soviet pilots later recalled how in head-on attacks, they were practically shielded by the massive engine, like a shield. Hitting the pilot was much harder than hitting the enormous rotating star in front. Of course, this idea had a flip side. The engine overheated during takeoff and landing, and at high speeds and altitudes, it, conversely, overcooled. This capriciousness needed to be tamed, and the engineers took a clever step, adding an auxiliary fan to the design, which was supposed to solve the problem. But this solution also had its peculiarities, and the story of how the designers fought the temperature extremes deserves separate attention. To tame the capricious nature of the BMW-139 radial engine, the engineers took an unusual step. An auxiliary fan was placed in the nose section. At the start, it boosted the airflow over the cylinders and reduced the risk of overheating, and after gaining altitude, it began to rotate in the opposite direction, protecting the engine from overcooling. It seemed the problem was solved, but practice quickly showed that there are no ideal solutions. The temperature balance was stabilized, but at a cost. In prolonged flights, the cockpit temperature sometimes rose up to 50 Cs. Pilots were literally melting in the cramped space, losing strength and concentration. All this was accompanied by additional aerodynamic drag. The fan created an extra load, albeit within acceptable limits. The designers faced a choice: either risk overheating and engine failure or sacrifice pilot comfort for the machine's reliability. Kurt Tank bet on the latter. Yet, despite these compromises, the project looked appealing. The military saw in it not just an unusual fighter, but a solution to a much more serious problem. Germany was starting to face a severe shortage of liquid-cooled engines. And in this situation, air cooling proved to be a salvation. This circumstance largely swayed the command in favor of the new project. By the end of the 30s, a real struggle for engines unfolded in Germany. Daimler-Benz and Junkers were working at their maximum capacity, but even that wasn't enough. Every new Bf-109 and Bf-110 required a DB engine, and bombers consumed huge batches of Jumo, He-11 and J-87, J-88. They all needed thousands of power plants, and the priority was given to attack aircraft. Fighters found themselves in a situation where engines were insufficient even for already planned production runs. In this environment, Kurt Tank's proposal looked less audacious than pragmatic. He suggested stepping out of the queue for liquid-cooled engines and betting on air cooling. Such a move freed the designers from dependence on overburdened factories and simultaneously solved the survivability problem. Yes, the engine looked bulky and created aerodynamic drag, but the strategic calculation was correct. Air-cooled engines in Germany did not directly compete with the scarce DB and Jumo engines. For the military command, this became a weighty argument. In conditions where production was bottlenecked, the FW-190 offered a path to mass production without the threat of disrupting the bomber program. The air-cooled machine not only promised reliability in combat, but also gave the assurance that it could be built in the necessary quantities. But the engine was only part of the picture. The true versatility of the Focke-Wulf lay in the fact that it was designed from the outset as a field aircraft, ready for rough airfields and harsh frontline conditions. And here, it had two key advantages: an unusual landing gear and a revolutionary cockpit canopy, which fundamentally distinguished it from its competitors. One of the most underestimated solutions that made the FW-190 a truly field fighter was its landing gear. Unlike the Messerschmitt, where the struts retracted towards the wingtips and created a narrow track, the Focke-Wulf was given massive wheels that folded inwards into the fuselage. As a result, the aircraft stood much more stably on the strip, ran less risk of tipping over, and could operate safely even from areas that could barely be called airfields. For the front, where concrete was rare and mud, dust, and potholes were common, this was a real salvation. The second trump card was the cockpit. Kurt Tank understood that in modern combat, survival belonged not only to the one with the sturdiest engine, but also to the one who spotted the enemy sooner. Therefore, the FW-190 was equipped with a large bubble canopy with a minimal number of metal elements. The pilot gained all-around visibility that had previously seemed almost impossible. Later, this type of glazing would become the standard for a new generation of fighters, but the Focke-Wulf paved the way first. The stable landing gear and panoramic visibility made the machine comfortable and reliable in the pilot's hands. But even these advantages paled in comparison to the most important feature: its teeth, for without powerful armament, no fighter could claim leadership. And the FW-190 had enough arguments to instill fear in any opponent. When it comes to the FW-190, many historians and pilots agree on one thing: it was a true champion of firepower. The Germans approached the fighter's armament without compromise. Two synchronized machine guns were housed in the engine cowling. Initially, 7.92mm MG-17 caliber, and later they were replaced by the larger 13mm MG-131. They served as a kind of sighters. The pilot would fire a short burst and, if he saw hits, shift fire to the main weapon. The main arsenal was hidden in the wings. Closer to the fuselage stood powerful 20mm MG-151 cannons. Further out, another pair of MG-FF cannons of the same caliber. The result was a symmetrical and extremely dense salvo. This configuration made the FW-190 a true flying artillery platform, capable of turning an opponent into a heap of mangled metal in a matter of seconds. The raw statistics are particularly impressive. The mass of the 1-second salvo of later FW-190 modifications reached 3.50 kW per minute. For comparison, the famous Soviet Il-2, the scourge of tanks and infantry, delivered about 2.65 km. The Soviet La-5, one of the best frontline fighters, had approximately 1.50 km. The British Spitfire Make 9s was around 2.02 km. Even the American-era Cobra, known for its 37mm cannon, fell short. Its salvo was approximately 1.60 km. The bottom line was that the FW-190 literally drenched the target in metal, creating colossal pressure on the enemy in combat. But sheer salvo mass wasn't enough. The Germans provided for flexibility of use. The pilot had the unique ability to control the fire as the situation dictated. Only machine guns to conserve ammunition, only a pair of cannons for attacking a bomber, or the entire battery for a decisive strike. A special system allowed for combinations to be selected literally on the fly, turning the cockpit into a control center for an entire arsenal. And here arises the main question. How did a pilot, caught in the vortex of combat, cope with this arsenal without losing concentration? The answer lay in the unique automatic control system that Kurt Tank had pre-planned, which relieved the pilot of unnecessary movements and left him with the most important task: keeping the target in the sight and pulling the trigger. One feature immediately stood out in the FW-190 cockpit, distinguishing it from other fighters of the time. Where the pilots of Allied planes or even Messerschmitts resembled octopuses, simultaneously jerking the throttle lever, adjusting the propeller pitch, switching supercharger modes, and monitoring fuel supply, the Focke-Wulf pilot's actions boiled down to a single lever. This control was a true pinnacle of engineering thought. By moving it forward or back, the pilot set the desired mode, and the automation itself established the optimal combination of parameters, switched supercharger stages, corrected the ignition timing, selected propeller pitch, and adjusted fuel supply. What required several movements and constant monitoring in other aircraft was performed automatically here, allowing the pilot to focus only on the main thing, the aiming and the conduct of the fight. In aerial combat, this provided a tangible advantage. The FW-190 pilot didn't waste precious seconds operating instruments. His attention wasn't scattered on the technical details. He could track the target in the crosshairs, choosing the moment for the salvo, while his opponent was forced to divide attention between the cockpit and the sky. This concentration often became the decisive factor in combat. But any system, no matter how perfect it seemed, also had a downside. The strengths of the FW-190 seemed obvious: survivability, powerful salvo, ease of control. However, this machine also had an Achilles heel, something that, in certain situations, turned it into a helpless target. Hidden beneath all the merits of the FW-190 was a weakness that every pilot knew. The machine was based on a heavy Bavarian engine, and for the sake of maneuverability and high speed, the engineers sacrificed wing area. This decision made the aircraft fast and sharp in a turn, but created a serious risk elsewhere. If the engine failed, it literally glided like a brick. If a pilot in a Spitfire or a Soviet fighter could still try to reach a clearing or a road, the Focke-Wulf left no chance for a forced landing. The high wing loading meant that without thrust, the heavy aircraft quickly lost speed and stalled. For frontline conditions where accidents were inevitable, this was a critical drawback. And yet, the engineer's choice was conscious. They knew that speed, acceleration, and maneuverability in combat were more valuable than the ability to glide in case of failure. The designers bet on winning the dogfight, even if it meant risk in non-standard situations. But could this equation be changed? The answer was to be provided by the new BMW 801 engine. More powerful, more promising, it promised to correct the balance between advantages and weaknesses. And it was around this engine that a new chapter in the Focke-Wulf story began. When it became clear that the BMW 139 wouldn't meet expectations, the designers made a difficult but strategically correct decision to replace it with the new BMW 801 engine. This was a much more powerful unit, specifically designed for a prospective fighter. But along with the advantages, it brought new difficulties. The BMW 801 turned out to be longer and heavier than its predecessor. To fit it into the design, engineers had to redesign the engine mount and even move the pilot's cockpit back by about 300 millimeters. On paper, this seemed minor, but in practice it affected the machine's balance and the pilot's perception. The center of gravity changed, meaning new solutions for controllability and layout were required. The work dragged on, but the result was worth it. The engine delivered a nominal 1,460 horsepower and up to 1,700 on takeoff, a serious leap forward. In the summer of 1938, the project, including all the modifications, was officially approved, and the company received an order for 4 prototypes. The first FW-190 V1 took to the skies on June 1, 1939. The tests immediately revealed the strengths: excellent controllability, good stability, and powerful acceleration. Minor defects were corrected on the fly, and the overall impression on the military was so convincing that the green light was soon given for preparatory serial production. By 1941, the first variant, the FW-190 A1, entered production. 102 machines were assembled in the second half of the year, and this was enough for the new fighters to begin arriving in combat units. A new force was forming in the air, which was to test itself not just in exercises, but directly in a dogfight with the main rival in the West, the Spitfire. It was there, over the English Channel, that the FW-190 was to undergo its true baptism by fire and show the worth of the efforts of Kurt Tank and his team. The first battles of the FW-190 over the English Channel were a genuine shock for British pilots. RAF flyers were accustomed to tough fights with the Bf-109 and believed they already knew the limits of German fighters, but the appearance of the Focke-Wulf overturned the established balance. The new adversary was about 30 kilometers stage faster than their Spitfire 5, climbed faster, and had higher acceleration dynamics. Even in a turn, where the Spitfire traditionally felt confident, the FW-190 could force a fight, compelling the British to play by unfamiliar rules. Its dive commanded particular respect. German pilots quickly turned it into a signature move. If the situation became too risky, they would literally plunge downwards, escaping at a very steep angle towards the ground. Even at a relatively shallow angle of about 30, the machine accelerated to an incredible 1,045 km/h. Pursuing it in this mode was madness. The structural limits of many Allied fighters could not withstand such speeds. The FW-190 offered the pilot an escape route, and the one who managed to dive usually evaded pursuit. For the RAF, this was a painful blow. Having barely regained equilibrium after the heavy battles with the Messerschmitts, the British once again found themselves playing catch-up. Their advantage, bought at a huge price in the Battle of Britain, literally crumbled in a matter of months. British engineers soon rushed to accelerate work on the new Spitfire McYath modification, which could counter the Focke-Wulf. On the Eastern Front, the picture was different. The FW-190 arrived here later, and by this time, a significant portion of experienced German pilots remained in the West, where the main threat from Allied aviation persisted. As a result, in the Soviet sector, mostly novices were in the cockpits. Even with a machine of outstanding potential in their hands, they couldn't fully unleash it. Soviet pilots noted that the Focke-Wulf was dangerous, but still, the Messerschmitt remained the main rival, earning the most respect and fear. This difference between the fronts showed a simple truth. Even the best fighter means nothing without a skilled pilot. In the West, the FW-190 was turning the tide of the battle. In the East, however, it was often lost against the backdrop of the familiar Mesters. But did this mean its potential was exhausted? Or did a different path of development lie behind these contradictions? A path that depended on only one factor. The FW-190 had a far greater reserve of structural strength than its rival, the Bf-109. The design allowed not only for the production of pure fighter versions, but also for transforming the machine into a universal tool of war. Many modifications served as fighter bombers, capable of attacking ground targets without losing their combat qualities in the air. This flexibility made the Focke-Wulf the backbone of the Luftwaffe, capable of covering several tasks at once when the Reich's resources began to dwindle rapidly. But every modification came at a price. The further the development went, the heavier the aircraft became. Armor, armament, equipment, all this increased the mass, and by the middle of the war, it became clear. The existing power of the BMW 801 engine was insufficient. German engineers dreamed of a new class of engine, capable of delivering at least 2,500 horsepower. Such an engine would have given the FW-190 a new lease on life, allowing it to maintain its advantage in speed and dynamics. But neither BMW nor Junkers could turn this dream into a reality. In the end, the fighter's fate was predetermined. It was versatile, user-friendly, and forgiving of errors, allowing even an average pilot to achieve outstanding results. Kurt Tank managed to create a true workhorse of the front, which delivered tangible benefits even when the cockpit housed an ordinary pilot, not an ace. This is the main paradox of the FW-190. It didn't become the absolute victor in the sky, but for many, it remains the best machine of the Luftwaffe because its strength lay not only in records or unique characteristics, but in its ability to deliver results where it was critically needed.